It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. If you reach out to me through my email, oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like our show, be sure and check out Patreon, Opperman Report Patreon. That's where you can find all the shows we play Monday to Friday, AM/FM radio. You can find them there with the commercials and the ads cut out. It's the best search engine to find old shows, so that's the best place. And it's very difficult, I know, to find the shows. So the old ones, you go on there through Patreon, the best search engine we got. Friday nights, 8 p.m., do a live show, Spreaker.com. There's a chat room. You get an email notification when we put up new content. I play repeats there every single night of the week, and that's probably the best archives, too, as well, but they have ads in them. Our guest today is Dr. Lawrence Spinelli, and the book he's written is Watergate's Unexpected Hero, The Life of Peter W. Rodino Jr. Remember the guy who chaired the Watergate hearings. Dr. Spinelli, are you there?
I'm here, Ed. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Before we get into your book here, Watergate's Unexpected Hero, about Peter W. Rodino Jr., tell us about yourself. Who is Lawrence Spinelli?
Well, thank you for the question, and I'm going to answer it by telling you a story which I think says it all. When I was about 10 years old, my Aunt Marie took me over to New York City. We went into Macy's department store, the biggest department store in the world, to the toy department. And it was before Christmas, and she handed me $10, this is a long time ago, and said, you can buy your Christmas present this year. Now, Ed, probably a normal kid would have settled for a football or a baseball, but what did I buy? A plastic model of the U.S. Capitol building with little plastic presidents all the way up to John Kennedy. Because even at the age of 10, I just loved history and I loved politics. And I had that set up in my room, and whenever I was home sick from school, I would play the Democrats against the Republicans, and I just cherished that. And my dream was to visit Washington and then eventually live here. And I'm so thrilled to say that my dream really did come true.
Yeah, now, I was looking at your bio a bit. Graduated George Washington?
I graduated from Drew University. I did graduate work at both Georgetown and New York University, NYU in New York.
Yeah, great. I'm an old New Yorker guy myself. Hard to believe, right? I lost my accent a long time ago.
Well, that's what I say, too, but people tell me I didn't.
I know, man. I know. They have no idea what it was like back in those days. Give me an idea. How old are you, though? 'Cause
I'm 72. I was born in 1952.
Exactly, 10 years older than me, 1962. But I definitely remember going to Macy's at Christmas time and sitting on Santa's lap and all that kind of stuff. My mom took me out there. Yeah, man, those are the days, right?
Absolutely.
Where do you want to get started with this here? The story of Watergate's Unexpected Hero, The Life of Peter Rodino Jr.
Well, let me start, because it's somewhat connected to the story that I just told. Let me start with my relationship with Peter Rodino. So here I am, a kid growing up in New Jersey, loving politics and loving history. And so I go to high school, and I was the president of the band. And one day they announced they're going to start a political club at my school. This is 1968. We're having a presidential election. So I got all my friends to go to the meeting, and they all voted me in to be the president of the political club. So one of the perks, or probably the only perk of that job, was if anybody famous ever came to Belleville High School, I got to go at the door with the principal to meet them. Now, Ed, I got to tell you, and I don't think this will surprise any of your listeners, nobody famous ever came to Belleville High School. But one day, the principal called me and said, Larry, our congressman, Peter Rodino. Now, this is way before Nixon, and he was known in New Jersey, but not really anywhere else. He's coming to the school. I want you to come and greet him. So I stood, I met him. He came and spoke to the students. I walked him out to his car. I told him all about the political club, how much we love politics. 3 days later, his office called me and said, would you and your friends like to be volunteers on our campaign? And it was the beginning, to paraphrase Casablanca, of a beautiful friendship. I worked on his campaigns. I was an intern in his Washington office, and eventually he's the reason I moved to Washington, and then I ended up working for him in his final years in the Congress. And I had always told him, I had hoped he would write an autobiography. He's the only person of note from that whole Watergate impeachment era that did not write a book, because he refused to cash in. He was offered a lot of money to cash in at 1974, and he refused it. But I had said to him, if you don't write your autobiography, I will do this someday. And he died in 2005. I was very honored to do a reading at his funeral. That's how long our relationship went on. And when I finally retired from over 30 years in the federal government, I said, this is what I'm going to do. So that's my Peter Rodino connection. Let me tell you a little bit about him, because he is such an interesting person. He was the son of an Italian immigrant. His father came here at the turn of the century, 1900. And I'm not sure if your listeners are familiar, but there was a huge wave of immigration in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because of all of the factories and the manufacturing, and we needed workers. There weren't enough workers. So a lot of people from Italy, Southeast Europe came here. Rodino's father was one of them, and he settled into a Little Italy section of Newark, New Jersey, where he had relatives. And that's where Peter Rodino was born in 1909. He was born Pellegrino Rodino. Eventually, when he got to school in Newark, and I'm sure this is true in other public schools, when you got to public school, if you had a non-English name, they anglicized it. Yeah. So Pellegrino became Peter. And that's where he grew up.
What luck, man! You ran into this guy. It was just like a fluke, you know. It changed the whole course of your life a bit, right?
Absolutely, it was life changing, and that's why this book was a labor of love, because I was repaying a debt to somebody that I owe so much to. But I also felt it was very important that people know his story, because this is what happens with history. You're over time, people forget about you, and people need to know who he was. He was, in 1974, probably one of the most famous people in the country. 80 million people watched the Nixon impeachment hearings, watched him, knew him, and I got to tell you, Ed, even in 1988, when he retired from Congress, so that's 14 years later, when I would walk through the Capitol building with him, people would stop him, and they remembered him. They would thank him. Thank you for saving the country. They would want to get a picture taken with him. So he was very well known then. But, over time, people forget. So I'm hoping they will read the book and they will remember what this man did for the country.
Yeah, and like you said, Watergate's unexpected hero, because he never wrote a book. He didn't do cash in like we know all those other names, because they went on that PR tour. To cash
exactly, because he refused to cash in. The other reason he's the unexpected hero is, if I can, finish with his story. So he grew up in this poor neighborhood, very poor neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey. He lived in a tenement building. When he was 10 years old, he saw somebody on the corner get shot. So this was a rough neighborhood. And, his family had no money. And in this neighborhood, the easiest way to get ahead was to either get involved in bootlegging or gambling. In other words, break the law, be a lawbreaker. And Peter Rodino did neither of those things. Quite the opposite. He became the guy who said no one is above the law and who defended the Constitution. And I think that's a tribute to his father, who really taught him a morality and imbued this into him, and that Rodino himself just believed that he was going to follow a very different path than other people in the neighborhood. But it wasn't easy. He went to public school, And he then couldn't afford to, he decided he wanted to be a lawyer because he wanted to do something where he could help people. But he realized he just couldn't afford to go to a law school full time. He had to go at night. So he started doing that. He had all these jobs, and then the Depression hit. And he couldn't even afford to do that. He lost his job. His father lost his job. So for 4 years, he toiled away at every kind of odd job, trying to save up enough money so he could go back to law school. I mean, he was a dispatcher for streetcars in Newark. He was a night clerk at a train station. He worked at this factory that made Ronson cigarette lighters. All those kind of jobs that you don't usually think of a member of Congress, a future member of Congress, doing that kind of work, dirt under their fingernails. But that's who he was. That's where he came from. And most important of all, I think I would want to say, is it just demonstrates his perseverance, his patience, his doggedness, all of these attributes that became invaluable, many decades later when he was managing the Nixon hearings. All of these things were there early on with him. And eventually he was able to go back to law school at night and complete his degree. And let me just give you an example of an average day, if I could. Is that okay, Ed?
Yes,
just to give you a little more
great.
detail.
Yeah, yes.
Because he told me these stories. I mean, working for him was such a dream as a historian because I would, I'd be in his office. I'd go in to ask him a question about something that should have taken 2 minutes. And 2 hours later, I was still there because he was telling me stories, I just wish I had tape recorders because they were so wonderful. So this was his day. He would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and get on the streetcar and go downtown to where the factory was for the 7 o'clock shift. He worked the early shift. The shift ended at 4. He would walk over to the law school and he would be in classes. He'd take classes at night. When the classes ended, he'd get on the streetcar, go back home. He'd study till about 2 o'clock in the morning. Then he would sleep. 5 o'clock, the alarm went off, and he'd start the whole routine over again. This is what he did every day. And he told me that when he graduated law school, the first thing that he did was throw the alarm clock in the garbage. Because that was enough.
Yeah, I believe it.
And that was his background. And then he kind of got into politics really almost accidentally because as a lawyer, he just had a little, one-person law practice, but he really felt this commitment to help his community. Now, we're talking about the 1930s now. Times were tough. It was the Depression, and the New Deal had just started, Franklin Roosevelt. And Rodino was aware of the fact that of all the different immigrants who had come to the United States, the ones with the lowest rate of becoming citizens were Italians. And part of it was because they were afraid of the government, their experiences back home. And part of it was because they didn't speak English. So Rodino used to give free classes in the neighborhood, English classes and citizenship classes. And eventually this came to the attention of the Democratic Party in Newark. And they said to him, look, would you like to help us go out and, we're trying to build support for Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And he did, and he started going around giving speeches. He spoke fluent Italian, so he could go to Italians and give it in Italian, give it in English. And that's how he got into politics. And then the war came, World War II came, and he was an advisor to the draft board. And because of that position, if he wanted to, he could have been exempted. Now, this is before Pearl Harbor. He could have been exempted from the peacetime draft. They started a peacetime draft in 1941, right before, just at the start of the year, really, I guess in the fall of 1940. But Rodino said, no, that's not right. So he actually volunteered. He was not drafted, volunteered, joined up, and went into the Army as a private and eventually went overseas. He was tapped to go into officer candidate school. He went to, was part of the American forces in the North Africa campaign. That was the first, this is now 1942. And it was so funny, Ed, because he had taken French in high school and he was in the French club. Well, that turned out to be a great thing because the language that they spoke in North Africa, these were all French colonies, was French. So he was very valuable to the military there. Then after that, the next place they went from North Africa, the Allies, they went to Sicily and then invaded Italy. Well, of course, Rodino spoke fluent Italian. So he was very valuable there. He was part of the occupation forces in Rome. And eventually, when the war ended in 1945, he started as a private. He came home as a captain with 2 Bronze Stars, a decorated war hero.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what was his rank when he left? That's incredible. You know,
Isn't that something?
And just think, the guy was already a lawyer. He didn't have to enlist.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That just, to me, that just speaks volumes about his character. And that's when he decided, when he came back, that, okay, I'm going to now pick up my political career again. And as I said, he was well known being the war hero in his part of Newark, this Italian-American section of Newark, where he lived.
Now, Newark in those days, Italian Americans in Newark in those days, they weren't the most civil rights or race relation types or immigrant voting. They weren't mostly of that opinion. Correct?
No.
Yeah. So
no. And in fact, I mean, the city of Newark. There was no legal segregation in New Jersey, in Newark. But just because it's not legal, there was certainly economic segregation and social segregation. So every part of the city, there was sections that were the Irish, there were sections that were the Italians, and there were sections that were the black neighborhoods. And there was rarely was there a lot of interaction between all these different groups. Everybody sort of, stayed in their own place, in their own area. But what made Rodino unique, and I would say to you, Ed, out of all the many things that I admire about him, this is the thing that I think I admire the most, is he became a New Dealer. His first ever vote was in 1932 for Franklin Roosevelt. Okay. Now, when he was in Newark and when he decided to run, he ran first in 1946 for Congress. He ran against a gentleman that people have probably not heard of, but they've heard of what he left behind, and that was a congressman, Republican named Fred Hartley, who left us the Taft-Hartley law.
Okay, sure.
And so he was the congressman. He had been, it was a Republican district, considered a Republican district. He had held that seat for many, many years. And so Rodino comes back in 1946, and he says, I want to run. The Democratic Party, which was a kind of a political machine there in Newark, they said, if that's what you want to do, fine, but we're not helping you. We're not giving you any money because this is a Republican district and we're not wasting our time. So they did Rodino a great favor, because what that meant was he had to go out and build his own little grassroots organization. He got his friends, they drove around, they had a little storefront, they had no money, and they did as the best that they could. But the two things that Rodino, well, there were three things really Rodino campaigned on that were important to him and remained important. The first one was to help veterans. He came back as a veteran, and he said, I want to make sure that all the promises that were made to veterans when they returned on housing and other things are honored. The second thing I want to do is I want to make sure that we reform immigration, because in 1924, the United States, after all these many decades of immigration, had passed what was the Immigration Act of 1924, which set quotas of how many people could come in from different countries. It didn't matter who you were, what your education was, what your skills were. If you were from certain countries, you weren't really welcome. And it was a really overtly racist law, and it discriminated mostly against Italians and Jews from Southeast Europe. And so Italian immigration had declined by almost 90% after 1924. A lot of families that had hoped to bring relatives over couldn't do that anymore. But more importantly than just the numbers, it was a stigma on Italians and on Jews and on the people that were excluded. Because what it was really saying is, you're less than. We want those white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from England and Norway, who, by the way, were not at all interested in coming to America. So it wasn't like they were filling up, the quotas. And we don't want you to come. So Rodino said, I want to change this to reform the law so it doesn't matter where you're from. It should be just a fair law. And then the third thing that he wanted to do was to bring about civil rights. And that's the thing that I think I admire him the most for, because, as you pointed out, he did not live in a neighborhood where there were African Americans. He did not interact with really African Americans on a daily basis. But he had experienced discrimination as an Italian American. The stereotype of, typing of Italian Americans, ethnic slurs. He was harassed and actually beaten up by the police once when he was walking home at night because they called him all kinds of, Italian slurs. And that instilled in him the notion of that everybody should have civil rights. And so he said, if I get to Congress, I'm going to press for civil rights for African Americans because this is what this country is supposed to be standing for. He didn't win the election. He lost by 5,000 votes, but he came much closer than anybody thought he would. And in 1948, 2 years later, Fred Hartley retired. I think he saw Rodino kind of nipping at his heels. And Rodino actually, again, the Democratic Party said, oh, this is a Republican district, you're not going to win. They didn't help him, but he ran and he won by 5,000 votes this time. He totally flipped it, and he became the congressman, and he held that seat for the next 40 years.
Incredible story. So then, what was his career like in Congress?
Well, here's another thing that I think speaks volumes about Rodino. So he gets to Washington. It's 1948. Harry Truman's the president. They didn't think Truman would win, but he won. And Rodino gets to Congress, and he was assigned to the Veterans Affairs Committee. And the rule in those days, less so today, but in those days, the Congress was run by the seniority system and dominated by the Southern conservatives who kept getting reelected and were in Congress forever. And so the rule as a freshman was, to be seen and not heard. Mind your business, So about 6 weeks after arriving in Washington coming to 1949 after getting sworn in, Peter Rodino totally violated that rule. He was in the Veterans Affairs Committee. The Veterans Affairs Committee was run by this Mississippi segregationist and anti-Semite, John Rankin. He was the most autocratic chairman of any committee in the House of Representatives. And he would have a meeting, and he would call for voice votes, and no matter what the voices said, he would decide it the way he wanted. There was never an agenda. He never gave people copies of legislation they were voting on. And there was a debate over a veterans benefits bill, and Rankin just jammed it right through. Rodino was outraged, and a couple of other members of the committee, and Rodino marched over to the floor of the House of Representatives and stood there raising his hand, signaling to be, acknowledged. And when the speaker acknowledged him, he got up to speak. And he said that later he was quaking. His knees and everything were shaking because he knew he was putting his really congressional career on the line. And he got up and he started complaining about what had happened in the committee, and he said, we veterans did not go fight in Europe for democracy only to come home and have to face this kind of undemocratic behavior. And when he was finished with this speech, the chamber burst into spontaneous applause, which you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to clap on the floor. This is from other members of Congress. They clapped because John Rankin was despised by everybody. And so Rodino thought to himself, this is the end of my career. And his remaining time on the Veterans Affairs Committee was very difficult. But fortunately for him, in the audience when he gave that speech was a congressman from Brooklyn. Most of your listeners probably don't know him at all, named Emanuel Seller. And he was a Jewish American liberal Democrat, and his nemesis in the Congress was John Rankin. So he was so impressed with Rodino that a couple months later, when there was an opening on the House Judiciary Committee, which Emanuel Seller chaired, even though that vacancy was supposed to go to somebody from Illinois, Seller intervened and gave the position to Rodino and changed the course of his whole congressional career. Rodino became Seller's right-hand man, and of course, more importantly, it was a committee that was responsible for the issues that we just talked about that Rodino cared about, which were immigration and civil rights. And so Rodino then was able to throw himself into the efforts to reform the immigration law, which took a long time, but finally, in 1965, well, thanks really starting with John Kennedy becoming president, being the grandson of Irish immigrants, he really gave it momentum to reform immigration. And, of course, sadly, Kennedy died in 1963. Lyndon Johnson continued this. And sitting at Ellis Island in the shadows of the Statue of Liberty in 1965, Lyndon Johnson signed the Immigration Reform Act, which did away with all these horrible quotas that said, we're not going to discriminate against where you're coming from. These are our criteria for immigration. Rodino was very much involved in that. And then, of course, all the major civil rights legislation, 1960, 1963, 64, 65. Rodino led the battle for the fair housing in 1968. I'm sure your listeners are aware of the iconic photograph. I mean, it's always shown everywhere. In 1964, when Lyndon Johnson was signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the first really major civil rights reform since the end of the Civil War, and he's in the White House in the East Room, sitting at a desk. Right behind Lyndon Johnson is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What most people don't realize is right next to Dr. King, Peter Rodino, wow, because he had played in that passage of that law. So those were the things that he was involved in. But Ed, the reason that he's the unexpected hero is because all of this was done because he wasn't the chairman of the committee. These were all done in the trenches, in the shadows. You know how Congress is, you don't necessarily, if you're not the chairman or you're not a grandstander, which Rodino never was, you're not going to get the credit and the attention for the things that you do.
Incredible. Watergate's Unexpected Hero, The Life of Peter Rodino by Lawrence Spinelli. So but that's right around the time, too, that he showed up at your high school and met you, right?
Exactly. So it all sort of, coalesced. So then, if I can tell one other story, sort of the coincidence of all of this, of his life. In 1972, because, every 10 years, when the census, we finish the census, we redraw the congressional district lines. And so in 1972, after the 70 census, Rodino ended up with a new district that it was his district, but with different lines, that was a majority African-American district. And so he had, and it was a Democratic district, so it wasn't the general election, but it was the primary. It was winning the nomination, the Democratic nomination. So he had an African-American opponent, and everybody believed he was going to lose. He was not going to win this primary. And the night of the primary, and I worked on that campaign for him. I was there in the ballroom at the Robert Treat Hotel in Newark. All the TV cameras and reporters from New York City who never cared about anything that went on in New Jersey, they were all there because they thought they were going to have a great story. Peter Rodino, after 20 years in Congress, was going to lose. But they didn't understand, again, they didn't do their homework. Because of Rodino's track record on civil rights, he was endorsed by many of the major civil rights leaders, including A. Philip Randolph, the man who founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the icon of civil rights. Rodino had gone over to New York to meet with him and ask for his endorsement. And because of that, he had a credibility among the African-American community. And not only did he win the primary, but he won by a significant enough margin that everybody knew he was going to be safe representing that district for however long he wanted to. But what nobody paid attention to, so this is in June 1972, across the river in Brooklyn, where Emanuel Seller, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, was in a primary. He was running against a totally unknown young woman who was challenging him. She ended up winning the primary by 800 votes. So within one fell swoop, Peter Rodino not only saved his political career, but in January, when the new Congress convened, he became the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and within 10 months, he was managing the first presidential impeachment since 1868.
Incredible. Now, and when did you go to work for him?
Well, I was on and off working for him in the summers in the 1970s. I was not there during the hot times of impeachment, and then I came back in the 80s when I was a college professor. I used to spend my summers there, but I worked full-time for him in the last years of his career in the 1980s.
Let me ask you this. Back in those days, did they have like the lobbying that we have today, the lobbyists and all the money slushing around and all that fundraising, constant 24/7 fundraising?
No, they didn't. There was some of that. There was some, there's always been lobbyists. I mean, you can go back probably, 100 years. And there was a need to raise some money, as things got a little more complicated and you had to go beyond just the typical brochure and start doing, radio and things like that. It got more expensive, but there's no comparison to the way it is now. And the other thing that you didn't have is all of these independent outside political action committees that literally now today, raising millions and billions of dollars and nobody even knows who's behind it all. That really didn't exist that much then.
Yeah, or these crackpot freshman House members, but they have a huge Twitter following. They just could pull up these hysterical stunts, all the time and get all this attention, Boebert, man, just because she did that stupid commercial walking to Congress with her gun, that we can't get rid of her. Now, was Rodino, did he have any kind of constitutional scholarship behind him to understand the weight of all this?
No, first of all, this is the hardest thing for people to understand today, because maybe we've gotten a little numb to presidential impeachments. Yeah. We've had 3 of them since Nixon. But remember, when this happened, first of all, this was the end of a very long saga with Nixon. It started in the break-in of the Watergate Democratic headquarters in June of 72. It was followed by the Senate had hearings. It came out that there are these secret White House tape recordings, that there was connections. The break-in was connected to Nixon's reelection and to actually people that worked in the White House. So this was a big snowball event that went on for close to, a year and a half, about a year and a half before finally what triggered it all was the Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon ordered his attorney general to fire a special prosecutor who was looking into Watergate and was coming up with indictments. And the Attorney General, refused. His deputy refused. They quit. They resigned. And eventually Nixon found somebody to do it. But this was this was like an atomic bomb. And this is, Rodino was sitting home in New Jersey when this hit. And he hurried back to Washington because he knew now there was going to have to be a presidential impeachment. He had been doing research. The Andrew Johnson impeachment of 1868 was not a good example. It was very partisan. It was not run very well. And so he had really decided before anything started that the most important thing for him was he wanted this to be bipartisan and to be fair. He wanted at the end, whatever was decided at the end, that the public would have confidence in whatever conclusion was reached. And so he felt that the way to do that was to go methodically, carefully, almost like a grand jury collecting evidence. One of the first things that he did when the impeachment inquiry was launched in October of 1973 was to hire a special counsel for the committee who was a Republican, John Doerr. That demonstrated, I want this to be fair. And, there were people who were very skeptical when Rodino was given this assignment in the Judiciary Committee because they said, who is this guy? Because people didn't know him. That's why he was unexpected. People said, oh, my God, he's from New Jersey. We don't know anything about him. He just became chairman of the committee. But again, nobody bothered to do the research to look into his life and to see the stories that I've just told you, to see that he had really led a life that had prepared him for this moment. And he had this doggedness, this patience, this sense of fairness to proceed, very carefully. And understand, Ed, I think people also don't remember, while this was going on, Rodino was also responsible for the nomination of the vice president of the United States for the first time in American history, because Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, had been found guilty of taking kickbacks when he was governor of Maryland, and so he had to resign. So under the 25th Amendment, which had been passed about 10 years earlier, this was the first time it was being used, Richard Nixon nominated Gerald Ford, who was the Republican leader in the House, and Rodino in the House of Representatives was in charge of the confirmation hearings. So he was managing that, and then, of course, at the same time, the impeachment came along. So he really did have the weight of the world on him, and as I said, people wondered, was he really up to the task? But he had this vision of doing this in a bipartisan, in a fair way, and he would not be rushed. And his good friend Tip O'Neill was the majority leader, then later Speaker of the House, used to, every time Rodino would go to the floor, Tip O'Neill would poke him and say, come on, Pete, hurry up, because he was getting flack from people, because the public was very upset. All members of Congress were getting letters, and Rodino would say, I'm not going to be rushed. I'm going to take my time because I want the people to be confident in whatever decision we made. And he did. So they started it in October of 1973, and they collected evidence. They met behind closed doors. They heard the evidence. They heard all these tape recordings of Nixon. And finally, this was through June, and then finally in July, they opened in open hearings. They started the process of considering articles of impeachment. Before they did that, they released all the evidence, so the public, it appeared in all the newspapers, so the public would know what the evidence was that the committee had. And then the committee began the proceedings, and of course this was watched by about 80 million Americans. So everybody watched this, and people took this very seriously. And, you can go back and watch the videos of this, and it contrasts so much with the kind of grandstanding you see today, because everybody, whether they were Nixon defenders or Nixon critics or in the middle trying to just make up their mind, everybody took this responsibility very seriously, gave very serious, sobering speeches. And, of course, some of them, like Barbara Jordan from Texas, became just, folk heroes because they were just so eloquent. But they went along carefully, cautiously, and eventually, with bipartisan support, with Republican support, they approved 3 articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon.
Yeah, this was an incredible time. I remember I was from the beginning of the Watergate hearings until the impeachment hearings. I was like 10 years old. And I can remember being in the Bronx. They had taken off all the TV shows in the afternoon. All 3 channels would play these hearings. And it was solemn, like you said. You could hear a pin drop. People took this very, very seriously. My mother would be ironing my father's shirts behind me as I'd be watching this as a little kid. And even I understood the importance of it all. And people had the attention span to sit down and pick up the New York Times and read the entire report back in those days. Completely different than how it is today. But what about behind the scenes? Was he under pressure from reporters digging into his background and different political forces?
Absolutely. The Nixon White House was trying to. They started spreading a rumor that that Rodino had ties to organized crime, and the New York Times ran that story, which I still think when I look back on it, and this was written by a reporter that Rodino knew. That really was pretty outrageous because there was absolutely not only no evidence. Right after it ran, the U.S. attorney and a federal judge in New Jersey, both Republicans, came out and said all of their investigations of organized crime, there's no connection. There's a bunch of baloney. So they tried to do that to intimidate him. It just didn't work. The stress and the pressure to know that the future of the country was resting on your shoulders must have been just unbelievable. But he soldiered on. He never let it show. He never complained. He just, he kept doing it and kept going forward and believing that this had to be done. This was the right thing to do. And I think feeling at least a relief that he was able to convince Republicans, not all of them at first, to come along so that it was bipartisan. And then, of course, they were getting ready to go to the Senate, to go to the House of Representatives floor to get the articles approved, and then the Senate for the trial. And then, of course, Nixon resigned on August 9th because the Republicans, again, it's hard to imagine that today, but the Republicans went down to the White House and said, if this comes for trial, I don't think there's 3 people that are going to vote for you. So I think you need to resign. So, Nixon resigned. The one thing that gave Rodino particularly a certain sense of satisfaction was when all the tapes came out right before Nixon resigned, Supreme Court forced him to release all the tapes, including the famous smoking gun tape, where literally 3 days after the break-in of the Democratic headquarters, you can hear Nixon on the tape telling the CIA to stop the FBI from investigating, which, of course, is obstruction of justice. And when all the Republicans heard that were on the committee, the ones that had voted for Nixon, had not voted for the impeachment articles, when they heard that tape afterwards, they all said, if we had heard that evidence, we definitely would have voted for this. And they actually signed a report that said that. So Rodino actually ended up with unanimity on the committee, which is what he, had really hoped for.
Now, when looking back at Rodino himself, did he ever confess to you, say, boy, there were certain things here I felt I mishandled?
No, there was one thing that he felt that he had mishandled, which he then corrected. So early on, before they really started going, he caved in to the liberal, the more liberal, not Rodino was liberal, but the more liberal Democrats on the committee who were really anti-Nixon right from the outset, and agreed that the committee could issue a subpoena as long as if Rodino approved it, and they didn't need approval from the ranking Republican on the committee. And there was a big uproar by the Republicans over this. And several of them went to Rodino and said, this isn't really right. You want to be bipartisan, and yet you're doing this. And Rodino admitted later, he said, that really was a mistake. He corrected it, and they changed it, and that both Rodino as the chairman and the ranking Republican, minority member had to agree to any subpoenas that the committee issued. But he said that was a mistake because it set a bad tone, and it's not what I wanted. But other than that, I think he felt that he did what needed to be done, handled it in the best way that he could. And I think the acclaim and the accolades that followed him afterwards, speak volumes about that. I mean, first of all, he was on a short list to be Jimmy Carter's vice presidential nominee in 1976. He went all over the country giving speeches. He would not take any money, but he said, I'm going to use my time to help causes I believe in, to help elect Democrats to Congress. And I had a former member of Congress, Jim Blanchard, who was governor of Michigan and ambassador to Canada, say to me, he was the most successful fundraiser I had in my whole political career was when Peter Rodino came out to Michigan in 1975 to do a fundraiser. So he really was so, very, very well known and so well regarded. And even when he retired in 1988, again, 14 years later, all the editorials and the news coverage of him, just, again, applauding that at a time of national crisis, that his calmness, his fairness, he really was, he was the right person at the right time. One publication said, just like a latter-day Lincoln, he came from nowhere and was the right person at the right moment. So I think he felt, very good about that. And ironically, every impeachment that followed, Clinton and the two Trump impeachments, both Democrats and Republicans have cited Rodino's management as the gold standard of presidential impeachments. Now, they haven't always followed it, but they've at least acknowledged that it's a gold standard that should be followed.
Now, as far as the Carter VP pick, he dropped out himself for personal reasons. What was his reason for dropping out?
Well, I think he realized, first of all, that it was unlikely that Carter was going to pick him because because of his age, and they were also not in sync ideologically. Carter was a much more of a conservative, moderate to conservative Democrat than Rodino, and he was very flattered that he was on the list. So to avoid any embarrassment, when he went to meet with Carter, he said, rather than put this on you, I'm going to withdraw my name. I'm having some issues with my eyes, and we'll make an announcement to that effect. So, this doesn't have to embarrass you. And Carter was so grateful, he invited Rodino to give the nominating speech at the convention in New York. So he got to do that.
Things were so different back in those days, you know what I mean? Now, what about Rodino? Did he have like a team of advisors around him? Any names you would recognize that were guiding him along the way?
No, interestingly enough, it's so interesting, compared to today. So, even when I was working for him, even as late as in the 80s, the staffs were not that big. Most of these members of Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives, were very self-sufficient. They were seasoned politicians, and, they managed. I mean, Rodino definitely, during the impeachment, relied very heavily on John Doerr. And I can't say enough good things about John Doerr. John Doerr was a lawyer. He had served in the Eisenhower administration and then at the Justice Department in the Kennedy administration, but he was a Republican. And he was in New York working for a nonprofit. And Rodino was he had a bunch of names. He interviewed a bunch of people, and he met John Doerr. John Doerr came down. John Doerr wasn't even that interested in the job, uprooting himself and to come down here to do this. But the two of them just clicked immediately, and they both had the same, view of proceeding carefully and thoroughly, and they just worked together beautifully. And John Doerr put together this amazing team, and Rodino said to him, you can put together the team you want, but with one caveat for me: no partisans. I don't want anybody that's a partisan, Democrat or Republican. I don't want them there. So on this committee staff was a young lawyer named Hillary Rodham, went on to be Hillary Rodham Clinton, and First Lady and Senator, and it was one of her first jobs. And William Weld, who went on to become Republican governor of Massachusetts. That was the caliber of the staff. It was they put together about 100 people, and they literally worked around the clock, starting in December of 1973 to August of 1974.
Yeah, William Weld worked for the Civil Rights Department or Justice Department, right?
Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
They were top-notch, all of them top-notch lawyers.
And you yourself, you were communications for Senator Joe Biden yourself. You're top-notch,
yes.
my friend.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's thank you for bringing that up because it's so ironic, Ed. The only time Peter Rodino ever endorsed a Democratic nominee before the convention was in 1987 when he endorsed Joe Biden, who was running the first time for president, because he had got to know Biden because Biden was on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And he came over and asked Rodino to be his national co-chairman. Rodino agreed to do that. Of course, that campaign didn't last that long. But then, of course, ironically, Rodino retired. I went to work for another congressman for 4 years from Long Island, who then was unexpectedly defeated. And then I went to work for Joe Biden. So I ended up actually working for two Judiciary Committee chairmen, House and Senate.
We're talking to Dr. Louis Spinelli. Great stuff, man. Watergate's Unexpected Hero, The Life of Peter W. Rodino. Now, you've written some other books here, too. Let me pull them up real quick.
Thank you for mentioning it. Well, the book that I wrote first, my first book was called Dry Diplomacy.
Yeah.
And it was the first and I think still only book written about the diplomatic impact of national prohibition, which people don't ever think about. So in 1920, we decided we're going to ban all the sale and manufacture and import of liquor. Well, the largest, exporter of liquor to the United States were the British. Well, they couldn't do that anymore. So what did they do? They sent all their liquor down to the Caribbean, and it was all then brought and smuggled into the United States. Caused a lot of problems, a lot of diplomatic problems, and eventually led to a treaty between the two countries. But a lot of interesting things along the way.
What inspired your interest in Prohibition?
Well, actually, I was more interested in the British-American tensions there. I was at NYU, and I was my specialty was history, American history, 20th century, and this was actually started as my doctoral dissertation. And then eventually I turned it into a book. I just was interested in how, because people don't think that when you do something that's a domestic issue, often they don't think, well, there are going to be any international repercussions. Yeah. And this was a classic example of that. There was a lot of international repercussions from this.
Well, then, what are your concerns when you see these ideas of broad tariffs just being it's just
well, I mean, exactly. I mean, I just shake my head because we, as much as we Americans, really almost since our founding, have wanted to live in isolation. We would like to blot out the rest of the world, and for a period of time, we were able to do that. But once we became, after the Civil War, became maritime power and started trading with other countries, you just simply can't do that anymore. And so as much as you'd like to shut the door and forget about the rest of the world, it just isn't that simple. And, of course, today it's a million times more complicated than it used to be.
And then how do you feel when you see, like, Marjorie Taylor Greene proposing impeachment of Biden? You know, she put something up there at one point. Do you cringe? What do you say? How do you want to leave?
It's very, it's very sad because and not even back to Rodino's day, even to my time working for Joe Biden when he was in the Senate. So my first day on the job with Joe Biden, he called me into his office and he said, "Larry, I just want to tell you something. If you ever say a bad thing about any other politician in our state, because at that point, the other senator and the sole congressman, they were both Republicans. He said, I will fire you. He said, because we in Delaware, we don't do that. We all get along. We treat everybody with courtesy and respect, and I wanted you to know that. And I got it. And that's the way it was. Peter Rodino's, some of his closest friends in the Congress were Republicans. Joe Biden's friends in the Congress were Republicans. And I worked with Republican staff people all the time. That's the way it was. There was a collegiality. You could disagree on policy, but you respected each other. You treated, each other with dignity, with respect. And it's very, very sad to see that a lot of that has gone by the wayside, because it means that you can't even have a reasonable conversation. You can't even look at the evidence, at the facts, and say, okay, let's talk about it. Could we maybe come up with a compromise? If you're shouting at each other, calling each other names, you're never even going to get to that place. And I think that's what's sad. And one of the things, I hope that my book, Unexpected Hero, I hopefully will instill in people at least some hope, some optimism that we once behaved that way. We once were bipartisan. We overcame a national crisis through bipartisanship and fairness, and maybe we can take some inspiration from that, and maybe we can get back to that place someday again.
But what, and also too, I would hope. Okay, I don't have much confidence in seeing that when we see what's going on here, man. But now I'm thinking back. Rodino was approving what do you call that? Anyway, the vice president pick, and Nelson Rockefeller wound up being vice president under.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So Nelson Rockefeller, billionaire, a lot of power, right? And now we see Elon Musk, with his influence and his power. Is that kind of influence greater today than it was back then with Nelson Rockefeller?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, so after Nixon resigned, then Gerald Ford became the president, and then we had it for the second time. So within such a short span, we twice had it replaced vice president. So Nelson Rockefeller was the choice. Well, of course, he was one of the richest people. Well, he got grilled for days and days and days in these hearings. He had to come back. He had to give all his tax records. But he ultimately had to put most of his wealth in these blind trusts that he had no control over. And I don't see that happening now. But that was the way it was. It's like, okay, it's one thing to be a billionaire, but you have to put all of your money and your investments and everything have to be in a blind trust so that we can have the confidence that anything that you do or say is not done to try to influence that. That's what happened in the 1970s. That's how Nelson Rockefeller, in those days, was able to become the vice president. And there were plenty of people who still objected to him and actually voted against his nomination because of his wealth, not because he was a bad person or not qualified for the job. He had been governor of New York, but because people were uncomfortable with his wealth. But as I said, there were a lot more safeguards in those days to block that off.
Do you have confidence that we can maintain our democracy?
I have to believe that we will. I have to be an optimist. One of my great heroes, idols in the world of history and historians is Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's just such a wonderful, and she is an optimist. So whenever I'm feeling discouraged, I think of her. She believes that the cycles of history are such an American history that it looks bleak, but somehow it swings back the other way. And if you look back in the past, that is true. So I want to be optimistic. I want to believe that hopefully, but the main thing, Ed, is that Americans have got to want to safeguard their democracy. That's in the 1970s with Watergate. That was the thing, and you pointed that out. People took the time. People read. People followed this. People said, "No, we this is a problem. We want to deal with this." People have got to want to make a commitment to say, "No, we want to save our democracy, and we want to support and the people that are doing it. We want to do what we need to do." That, I think, ultimately is the key. And America's been lucky enough since the very beginning, since even before the American Revolution, when it never looked like we would get our independence, and through the American Revolutionary War, where it looked like George Washington was going to be finished any moment, we always were lucky enough to have the right people at the right time: Abraham Lincoln, Peter Rodino during Watergate, Franklin Roosevelt in the Depression, to get us through these moments and then to get the support of the people. So that's really, I think, what's going to determine our future. But I want to stay optimistic.
Dr. Lawrence Spinelli, we're out of time. I've enjoyed this interview more than I have in months and months and months. I can't thank you enough. Dr. Lawrence Spinelli, the book is called Watergate's Unexpected Hero, The Life of Peter W. Rodino Jr. 5 stars. You can't beat that, okay? And then 2024 Best Book Awards finalist for Biography. You hear the man talk off the top of his head with such passion. You got to buy the book and read what he has to say. Watergate's Unexpected Hero, The Life of Peter W. Rodino Jr. Dr. Lawrence Spinelli, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed.
Good night, sir.